Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a good day. Starting before, a little pre-roll of some music here. Lost my corporate job after 10 years. Congratulations are in order. Okay, time to make stories. This is Super Blade Runner, David. Thanks. I actually really like the music of Vangelis or Vangelis. He's an Italian electronic or acoustic. I don't know. He gets called like an acoustic electronic composer. He did the soundtrack to Blade Runner and Chariots of Fire, famously. And he was to me, I don't know. There's a whole strain of Italian modern music that is kind of ignored when it comes to studying 20th century music. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but there's Italian atonalism. Like usually when you study atonalism, you're gonna study like Schoenberg, like these Germans, right? And maybe it's because of like German immigrants coming over, and that's the old story. It's like, why does everybody talk about Beethoven and Bach? It's all the Germans, and there were these German teachers. So yeah, Schoenberg and Webern. And then you start talking about American like serialists. So yeah, Schoenberg, Webern, maybe Stravinsky, but like Stravinsky's like, well, he's only atonalist in one period of his career. So yeah, maybe Stravinsky, but you don't talk about the Italian atonalists a lot. And there's quite a few of them. Ligeti and anyway, there's like this whole strain of Italian contemporary music that gets ignored. Not ignored entirely, but it's just not emphasized when you're studying music history and things like that. You tend to just focus on the Germans for whatever reason. It's a German dominance. I got a bit of a fisheye. I forgot I had the fisheye on this thing. So we're gonna have a fisheye. We have a bit of a fisheye stream, I guess. It means we can move it like really close. Get a really close-up view here. Is he the one who did 12 o'clock? I always liked that one. I have to think. But yeah, Vangelis is an Italian, and he, for electronic music, was like, no. Electronic instruments are just an extension of the things we already do, and we don't need to emphasize them as we're working in the electronic space. He wanted to use real instruments alongside synthesizers. He views synthesizers as a way to program new and interesting sounds and textures to go with things that have already been established, that there's no reason those things can't mix together. So I'm a big fan of his music. In fact, like him not being in Blade Runner 2049 was like one of the big signs to me why I never watched the movie. It was like no one's involved, and not even the music is going to be the same. And this is something I just as a little bit of a sidetrack before we get into the subject of today's stream. Let me take this. Not the hat. I'll leave the hat on. It's a nice cold day. Let's take off the guitar. The legendary Parker Fly with the curly guitar cable. Let me tell you, Parker Fly, if you're like, what's the best production model guitar ever made? It's the Parker Fly. It's like no contest. Like I love my Strats. You're going to see me playing my Strat and my Tele probably more than my Fly on this kind of stuff because I've just set them up to have a different kind of tonal variety than what I usually work with when it comes to the Parker Fly, which has an acoustic pickup and has these great DiMarzio pickups that are amazing for heavy metal and stuff. Anyway, yeah, Parker Fly, it's great. I thought I'd play with it around a little bit today. Anyway, let's talk about Vangelis and like Blade Runner 2049. What people think of as electronic music today, I guess, is not what people thought of as electronic music in 1980. And they're so different as to be almost incomparable. So the music of Vangelis, where he's mixing acoustic and electronic instruments, that seemed very novel at the time, but the music holds up because it has a unique tonal character. And I noticed this with the music from Tron, which was done by Walter Carlos, aka Wendy Carlos. And it's a true electronic soundtrack, right? It's using electronic instruments for their own purposes to create novel and interesting textures, which you haven't heard before, versus the, in my opinion, god-awful soundtrack of Tron Legacy, done by Daft Punk. I'm not a fan of Daft Punk, and I'm really not a fan of Daft Punk as a soundtrack device. So I don't like their music. I find it very annoying. When it's not boring, I find it annoying. But it's really like EDM music piping over a sci-fi movie, and it just doesn't work for me at all. It produces no sense of like computerization. It just doesn't do any of that stuff, really. But people think of that as electronic music in 2015, 2020, whenever. There we go. There's a little bit of light. Now y'all can see me. That's what they think of as electronic music. This is something that I've learned. As a teacher, people are like, well, the electronic music is this. I'm like, that's EDM. That's electronic dance music, or it's techno or house. Like, that's its own kind of genre of music, which is cool. And yes, it uses electronic instruments, but it's not electronic music the way Walter Carlos was, or John Chowning, or Morton Subotnick, or Vangelis, or any of these guys from like the 70s and 80s who were working, in my opinion, a much more creative and interesting space. They were classical musicians. They were trying to make new and cool compositions using electronic instruments. They were approaching it from the tradition of experimental classical music and not dance music, right? Dance music has its own trajectory. So when I heard like all the Daft Punk crap in Tron Legacy, I thought was just awful. Just one of the worst parts of the movie by far. I felt like the movie, I'm not going to do a full review of it right here, but I feel like the movie was a big failure. I know that may piss off a lot of people who really liked it, but it's just another example of like kind of a skin suit missing some of the points of the original, and then just trying to emulate. It's like it's emulating the aesthetics that were inspired by Tron. So you're like two layers removed, and so it has a very uncanny feeling. I'll talk about that in a full review. Okay, today's subject is plot. What is plot when we're talking about storycraft? What is plot? Well, plot is actually, before I go any further, let me promote some stuff. Patreon. You can join my Patreon. I'd love to have people who want to do like the masterclass streams, but I haven't had people really want to do that yet, which is okay, but I would love to have something like that. Also, the No Talkie Talkie channel. Let me find it. YouTube.zoolonline. If you like the music, you can have a lot of that. I just came out with a 50-minute long piece, fully played live. 50 minutes of live improv, structured live improv with some ambient rain. So you can check that out. That was way more effort than I thought it would be for 21 views. But that's it. I got 100 subscribers on that channel, which is great. I love it. So Hardwick Bentho says, I generally like orchestral arrangements of Vangelis' music better than the originals. The London Symphony Orchestra version of Chariots of Fire, for instance. So when you are arranging it for just like standard acoustic instruments, you're still getting the composition, right? Vangelis is a composer. And so the music it uses traditional compositional approaches. And that's part of what makes it good. The electronic elements, especially in something like Blade Runner, are really what elevates the music and makes it sound special for that music. So you have to keep that in mind whenever you are kind of critiquing the music. Is that he approaches it with the instrumentation in mind, and it creates something very novel and interesting. I'm not against like Pop's performances of soundtracks or something. especially if they're arranged in a way that's more classical and not as much soundtrack. That's fine, but I tend to always go with like, what did the original composer intend? And, was that successful? Maybe it wasn't successful with Chariots of Fire. Maybe that's something you have to think. It's like, probably would have just been better with orchestra and not all the electronic stuff. But, I like the inclusion of the electronics nowadays. And it was certainly novel back at the time as well. If you listen to something like Switched on Bach, it's just Bach played with a Moog, right? So it really shouldn't be all that interesting because it's just Bach. But it ends up being pretty interesting because of the weirdness of doing a different instrumentation, I guess. Right? I guess that's what I'm going for. Sorry, I'm rearranging my windows now as we talk. All right, let's talk about plot. Okay, so here's what you need to know about plot. I'm going to talk about setting, characters, and plot. What is plot? What do I mean by plot? To me, plot is the event sequence of a story. The event sequence, the things that happen. A lot of times people think of the plot as the story. And that's why I'm like, no, it's not the story. The story includes the setting, which is where the plot exists and takes place. The story includes the characters who execute the plot. They're very important. And hopefully I've established the importance of having good characters because they're the thing that people tend to really attach themselves to when they are reading your story or watching your movie, is that the presence and the likability of the characters really can't be understated. Describing the characters and their history is part of the story. Having the characters have a motivation for doing the things which make up the plot is a vital part of the story. That's why plot is kind of at the top. It's the stuff that happens. What do you need to know about plot? I may have to extend this into 2 streams, so I'm not going like super, super, super long. But if we do, so be it, right? Plot exists because you have a conflict. So that's the first and most important thing you have to think about with plot. What is the conflict? You hear this word conflict and you think conflict like two characters fighting each other, and that can be a conflict, right? A protagonist and an antagonist facing off like in a superhero story or something like that. But that's not conflict in its entirety. A conflict is just a problem that has to be solved. It's something that has to be changed about the world or the setup that you've created. And the characters have to be motivated and able to make that change. So the conflict could be like in a romantic comedy. I'm lonely. That's the conflict. The main character's lonely. How are we going to solve that conflict? By finding true love. How we find true love is the plot. That's the how of the why. So the why is part of the character motivations. The plot is going to be what you do to solve the problem. The events which happen that either the protagonist or the antagonist are afflicting the protagonist. That's a style of writing too. You could just have a protagonist that's being, kind of flopped through a plot, kind of carried by the gods against his will, like with Thomas Covenant or something like that. That also works. But, it's all about execution. So the conflict. We don't need to break down every single type of conflict. I think categorizing conflicts broadly can be useful, but if we're trying to come up with like a billion little categories for every kind of conflict that has ever existed, we'll be here all day, and then you're going to find about a million exceptions because how you write your unique story is unique. So the conflict is going to be unique. So a couple of broad categories. One is a mystery. So a mystery is there's a mystery that has to be solved, right? We have to figure out who did a crime, or we have to figure out what's actually causing something. So there's an unknown which has to be uncovered. That's a type of plot. And so mystery plots focus around figuring out the solution to the problem. Like this, we know the solution is hidden. The problem is it's hidden. So the conflict is we don't know. And so that's a mystery plot. Mystery plots are in all kinds of genres, not just mysteries. If you're reading a lot of classic pulp tales, They're explicitly in the genre of mystery, but you can also have a mystery plot in a fantasy book like Harry Potter. The Harry Potter books are actually all mystery plots. Pretty much all of them are mystery plots. Harry's trying to find something out. That's his motivation for doing things. And that's the main conflict when we begin most of the stories. We don't have a conflict of we need to just kill Voldemort. Even the 7th book, which is like, we got to stop Voldemort, is uncovering the mystery of the Horcruxes and the Deathly Hallows. So we're uncovering mysteries even in the 7th book. So you can have mysteries in any kind of plot. Another broad kind of conflict is what some people call man versus environment or man versus nature, which is like a survival story. There is a danger to the protagonist, and the plot will be resolved by the protagonist overcoming and avoiding that danger. Now, that danger could be anything. I think most horror stories would actually fit into the category of man versus nature. There's a monster, and we have to survive the monster. Is the monster an antagonist? No, he's more of a force of nature unless he has a personality, then he becomes an antagonist. So with something like The Edge, a movie like The Edge, which is, I don't know, a really good movie. I keep thinking about it. Like, it's a good movie. What's the main conflict? The main conflict is they're in the wilderness and they have to survive. And they have to survive, and a bear is trying to get them. Is the bear the antagonist? This is always, like, this would be a great discussion for an English class, because kids would go with, like, what textbooks say. They're like, well, obviously the bear is the antagonist. It's like, how can the bear be an antagonist? He's not a person, right? He has no human motivations. He's just a hungry beast that if a dead deer were between him and the people, he would just eat the deer and probably just forget about the people, right? But it's more about how are they going to survive it, right? Like Jaws, what's the antagonist of Jaws? Maybe the mayor would be closer to an antagonist than the shark. The shark is a force of nature, so it's really man versus nature or man versus environment. I think of like man versus environment like PvE, player versus environment. There's something that has to be overcome that's not a human acting against you, right? Another broad kind of conflict is just going to be man versus man, two men facing off. This is the standard setup for a superhero story. Sandman wants to rob the banks. Spider-Man is going to stop him. All right, man versus man. Pretty broad ones. Now, the reason, like, well, can mystery be man versus man? Yeah, I mean, you could cross over these, but mystery is really about uncovering something. So that's the goal versus man versus man is about overcoming another person's plans. And man versus environment is like surviving something that's in the environment, trying to stop you. What would be the plot of like Star Wars? Is it man versus? No, it's really man versus man. It's, who's the antagonist? It's kind of Darth Vader. Darth Vader is trying to stop the protagonist from blowing up the Death Star, right? So the conflict in a broader sense has like bigger implications, but when we talk about how it operates, it's Darth Vader versus the good guys. And like Grand Moff and Darth Vader versus Obi-Wan and all the good guys, right? So it's really like a man versus man kind of category. The usefulness of thinking of that helps you to know what your characters are doing and where they're going to be as you execute the plot. So when you're writing a book or you're making a movie or a game, anything, you really want to lead with the conflict. The conflict is why the people should be reading. Why does the plot matter? Why are the characters trying to do something? That motivation is at the core of the conflict. Like, why does it matter? A killer has to be stopped. Okay. We have to solve the mystery of the plague afflicting everyone. Right? We want to see that happen. So leading with the conflict is really important. I hate to use the word ideally because there's so many exceptions to this. You could think of about 1,000 exceptions to everything I'm going to say today. This is just a starting place for thinking about your work. Ideally, you're going to introduce the conflict in the first chapter, ideally in the first couple pages, or ideally in the first sentence. I used ideally for all of those, right? Different books do different things. How does The Hobbit begin? In a hole there lived a hobbit. There's no conflict in that. The conflict doesn't begin until Gandalf shows up and has a conversation with Bilbo and decides that he's going to thrust him into an adventure. And then we actually have a little bit of conflict, which I think is interesting to think about. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. We're leading with conflict big time in that Stephen King book. Man versus man. There's a man and a man in black, obviously the bad guy. He's fleeing across the desert. We have a setting, character setting, and the gunslinger followed. Character setting, plot in one sentence. How great is that? So yeah, ideally you want to lead with the conflict so that the people reading have a reason to keep reading. Now you can start with a character. If you read Elric of Melniboné, it starts with a character. You don't have to start with plot. There's no rule that says you have to, but you're going to want to establish your conflict early on, whether it's an interpersonal conflict or it's an external conflict. Those are other kinds of categories, right? An interpersonal conflict is like, I have to fix something about me. External conflict is, I have to solve something about the world, right? Elric's conflict is more about himself than it is about the world. Anyway, yeah. And these things, you can have multiple conflicts. So that's the next thing that I'll get to. But if you leave that conflict, it gives the readers a really good reason to continue reading or watching or whatever they're doing with your media. Let's talk about different levels of conflict, what I call the A, the B, and the C story. You may have heard this in writing clinics or, I don't know, in writing books. It's a really common way of describing a standard 3 main plot, 2 subplot story. You'll see this with like South Park because Trey Parker and Matt Stone are actually really good writers. They understand the craft. They're able to take their ideas and just like plug them into a, they're able to plug it into these sort of plot formats that we're talking about and make a banger episode really quickly because they have a lot of practice doing it. They're not, okay, here's the thing that's going to happen. Here's how they're going to solve it. And then we'll add in a B and a C story. So the B story is just a subplot that involves some of the characters that is related to the main plot, the main conflict. So a typical A story would be, let's imagine a sports story. We have to win the big boxing match. What's the B story? Oh, it's a romance between the boxer and the woman who loves him for who he is. So something like Rocky. A story, Rocky's got this big fight. B story is, yo, Adrian, right? You may have a C story. The C story can be a third character's conflict, Apollo Creed and his, whatever his motivations are, might be a C story that contributes, and everything will lead together in the climax, and hopefully you'll solve all the subplots in the climax. And you want to think about, as far as subplots, your main conflict is the main thing. The story's over when that main conflict is resolved. Your subplots, they kind of need to resolve quickly or near the main resolution, or it's not going to work. So like if the guy, if your character becomes king, well, he needs to like solve his romance. He needs to like marry his girlfriend pretty quickly to solve the romance thing. Think of something like The High King by it's part of the Prydain. Who am I thinking? Lloyd Alexander. Okay, kid becomes king. Well, we have a big B story that's been hanging around in every book, like his relationship with Eilonwy. Okay, they're going to get married. All right, let's just resolve that real quick, right? So it's important to resolve the subplots pretty much at the same time you resolve the main plots. Otherwise, that falling action doesn't work. So next thing we'll talk about subplots. Let's talk about plot structure and plot formats. This is the thing that I think most people get hung up on because they want something to like plug in the numbers with. And if you're looking for that, like if you're writing a screenplay, you may need to look at something like a beat sheet to get all of that stuff down. So something from Save the Cat, he'll have like a beat sheet, This happens at this minute, this happens at this minute, this happens at this minute. Some people like to get really specific into the details about when these things happen. I personally hate that, and I can feel it. Once you know the beat sheet for Save the Cat, you almost know how many minutes have transpired in a movie based on what schlocky event is going to be plugged in next, even where it doesn't belong. This is, I think, one of the main problems with a lot of modern movies is that they try to be too rigid with their placement of plot ideas to the detriment of the movie, where they could just leave some out. Not every movie has to have a romance. Not every movie has to have a dark night of the soul or some crap like that. You can do things that are outside of that. And you can also place them at different places to create different effects. If you want to have the dark night of the soul 30 minutes into it and then have a long set of repercussions from that then result in an unexpected climax, that would be far more interesting to me than, oh, he's having dark night of the soul. We must be 98 minutes into the movie. Yep, on the dot. We're 95 to 98 minutes. If you ever look up beat sheets for movies, it's just like, oh no, AI is going to write the scripts. I'm like, AI is already writing the scripts. They use such a rigid format in Hollywood for most movies, like most normie movies, that you really aren't losing anything by going with AI. It's already so rigid. Anyway, a lot of people want to plug that stuff in without thinking about what these things do or why plot structure matters. The basic structure of a plot always needs to be conflict resolution. That's what's going to determine your structure. The greater the distance between the introduction of the conflict and the resolution of that conflict, the longer the story is, the more moments you have to have in between that will either raise the tension or resolve the tension or do both at the same time. This is where subplots become useful. You can resolve a subplot a little bit while raising the stakes or raising the tension, the uncertainty about the outcomes of a different conflict. So you can have this feud going on where we're uncertain about our romance is great for this because people are always uncertain about how the other person feels about him. We're uncertain. Is he going to get with the girl? Oh man, she's going to break up with him. While they have kind of solved a problem with the main one. Okay, she's going to stay with him, but now the bad guy's coming back, right? So you can kind of get this thing flowing. If you have nothing but tension the whole way through, people will actually get exhausted and will stop reading. They'll close the book. If you just have no resolutions of any kind between point A, the beginning, and the end. You have to have some. Or people will not have a resting point for what they're doing. Okay? So the greater the distance, the more little extra points that you're going to have in there that are going to have an effect on the reader, either be a resolution or like an adding of tension. Whether you kind of divide that up into 3 acts, or you divide it up into 5 acts, or 2 acts, or however you want to think about it, or you're doing an Odyssey plot structure, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it fits the story that you're imagining. So let me go over a couple of different plot types, because people always, I should say plot structures, because people always like to talk about plot structures and think about plot structures and what's going to happen in them. Let's start with a standard 3-act plot structure. 3-act plot structure is what you're going to see in most movies. It's what you're going to see in sitcoms. It's what you're going to see, I guess, in most things. Most things are going to have a 3-act plot structure these days. It works really well. It's just a way of organizing things into 3 distinct areas. The first area we usually call an exposition. Exposition's where you tell the reader about everything that they need to know to understand the story. Who's doing the story? What's at stake? Who the characters are? What the setting is? You're going to tell them all of that stuff. And then hopefully in that exposition, you're going to introduce the conflict, and the exposition will close with a major event that makes the conflict more present. Turns the conflict into something that the characters have to deal with immediately. So that's the end of the first act. The second act is what we call a chaos act. It's where all the characters, protagonists and antagonists, are reacting to each other and trying to find a solution for the conflict. They're trying different things out, right? So in a mystery type plot, that middle act would be uncovering lots of clues and coming up with lots of different hypotheses for the solution. Right. In an action plot, it would be the hero chasing the bad guy or the bad guy chasing the hero or vice versa, interchange of things. That act will close with an attempt by the protagonist to solve the problem that looks like it should work. From his perspective, it'll work. And then it doesn't work. And so then you have a third act, which is the climactic act, where we have the tension go to its maximum amount. The bad guy's going to win. The heroes are going to get eaten by the bear. And then it'll turn around, hopefully in an unexpected way. And then you have what's called a falling action, where you are basically tying up all the conflicts. You're saying the solution to this conflict is this, solution to this is this, solution to this is this. And you have the characters do those. And then the story ends. Okay, so that's the third act. I like the 3-act plot structure for a lot of things. I think it works great. If you are too rigid with it, it becomes predictable. Where you can look at the book and you're like, I'm about 2/3 of the way through the book. He's got this figured out. Now, if you're experienced, you know he doesn't have it figured out. So you know that like the next thing that happens is not going to be what's real. Right? It's going to be a false ending, and then you're going to have a revelation or something's going to happen that's going to make him do things differently, right? So like think of, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. What's happening in that third act? Well, in the third act, the transition into the third act, they are going through all the traps and trying to get to the Sorcerer's Stone. And, it turns out that it's not like they decide that in that third act, it has to be Snape that's going to do it. So they fail, and it's actually Voldemort, right? And so then it's like surprise, and the resolution is something wholly unexpected. Then we have a falling action that occurs after that. We tap all the loose ends. We say goodbye to all the kids from Hogwarts, and that's the end of the book, right? So these acts do not have to be the same length, by the way. They can be different lengths. Like Act 1 can be short or long. Act 2 can be short or very long, and Act 3 can be short or really long. Just depends on how you want to structure it. The point at which like the third act really begins in like most cases is when you're thinking of like the hero taking on the villain for like a final battle. All right, so that's a 3-act plot structure. Let's talk about a 5-act plot structure. 5-act plot structure. 5-act plot structure is what you're going to see in something like Shakespeare. Notice Shakespeare writes these things in 5 acts. They're formally divided into 5 acts. Now you could actually like say, oh, well, this one's actually more like a 3-act. Well, it doesn't matter. For practical reasons, it was always divided into 5 acts because that's how it was performed. You would have set changes and things happen between the acts. Here's how the 5-act plot structure actually works. Your first act is exposition of characters and setting and maybe a little bit of conflict, a problem that the characters want to solve. That's first act. Second act is an event that happens that puts the rest of the play into motion. So in Tragedy of Julius Caesar, it's Julius Caesar being assassinated. So that's Act 2. Act 3 is characters reacting to the event of Act 2 and setting up for Act 4. Act 4 is the climax, the end of Act 4. So it's where the characters are doing things to fix the problem that really took off in Act 2. And then Act 5 is the resolution. And you'll notice that these are rarely the same length. So if you look at Shakespeare, you'll notice often Act 1 and Act 2 are rather lengthy. Act 3, maybe a little bit not as lengthy. Act 4, often longer than Act 3. And then Act 5, maybe the shortest of all of them, because it just depends how much there is to resolve and to tie up at the end of Act 5. So Macbeth has, the same kind of thing. Hamlet has the same kind of thing. You end with this duel, It works. Like it's a 5-act structure. I've used both of these, by the way. So if you read Muramasa Blood Drinker, which I don't have a copy. I have to get up to the bookshelf to get a copy. It's divided formally into 5 act areas. The first act is introducing the problem. The second act is something kind of big that happens that changes the direction. The third act, we're chasing the bad guy and introducing another character. Fourth act, we are taking steps to resolve the conflict. Things happen, things don't resolve the correct way. And in the fifth act, we actually solve the problem. So that's the way that I divided up the formal structure of Mormasa Blood Drinker. It doesn't matter which one you choose or how you want to divide it up. It's just a way of thinking about how to organize the events of your story. The next one, the next big one you'll see a lot is what I call the Odyssey plot structure, taken from the Odyssey. Now, the Odyssey is really more of an episodic structure, meaning rather than having this structure where everything's related to the final conflict, you have a bunch of little episodes that each one has their own small conflict in it that has to be resolved. So there's a conflict and a resolution, maybe in every chapter, maybe in every episode of what you're doing. That's an Odyssey. And you have to think about like Odysseus going through and all the adventures Odysseus has. Like he has one conflict, which is, I got to get home to my wife. And there's all these obstacles. There's all these things that happen to him along the way. So one of the things that happens is, he washes up on the island with, was it Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and they get trapped in the Cyclops cave. And how are they going to get out? Well, they hide underneath the sheep, or they blind the Cyclops, but they can't get out. They have to hide underneath the sheep. And then, he curses them because he's actually Poseidon's son, all that kind of stuff. So you have a conflict and a resolution just on the island. Just the island by itself makes its own little story. Books that use this, really popular ones, are things like Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, especially. So The Hobbit is probably one of the best examples of an Odyssey plot structure in a modern book. Bilbo has to go to the Lonely Mountain. We're going to get the treasure. Okay, we got the conflict. Getting there, that's what's called there and back again. How are we getting there and how are we getting back again? All right, so we're going to get there through many, many different adventures. Trolls are going to eat us. There's a little mini story right there. Each chapter of The Hobbit you could read on its own as its own short story. The trolls are going to eat us. The goblins captured us. The Gollum wants to eat me. The wolves are going to eat us with the goblins. We have to convince Bjorn to not kill us and to give us food. That's a conflict, right? How, this is an interesting thing. It's like, ooh, they cut this out of like the cartoon, like going to Bjorn's house. Well, it's important. They need food. And what's the conflict there? Well, Bjorn could probably turn into a bear and eat them. We have to get on Bjorn's good side. How are we going to do that? Well, it's about Gandalf being kind of sneaky, putting on just my wizard hat, right? Gandalf comes in. It's like, okay, well, I'm a wizard, as you can see. I'll have a dwarf and a hobbit with me. Oh, there's more dwarves. So he like slowly gets Bjorn kind of acclimated to what's going on. Tolkien even says like, Gandalf was using a good storytelling technique to draw Bjorn into the story so that he would have more sympathy for them. That's its own kind of conflict. Is like, how do we get Bjorn to care about what we're doing? Those sorts of episodes. Okay, so those are 3 kind of big plot structures you can use. You don't have to use them, or you can think outside the box. There's many examples of like postmodern books that don't stick to this and are still really interesting, like American Psycho or Catch-22 or something like that. So you can always think outside the box or use them as a starting place for thinking about how your events relate to the overall conflict. And the other thing about plot events is that you usually want plot events to have some sort of rhyme and reason to them, meaning things happen because another thing happened, right? We have to do this because this happened, right? We have to get Bjorn's help because we lost all our baggage because we slept on the goblin's doorstep and we attacked the goblins and now they all want to eat us, right? So there's you always want things to flow one to the other with a reason for them to exist. You don't want characters to be doing things without a reason for doing them. You want characters to do things for a reason, and that means that each event should have some relationship to the previous event. One of the reasons that Odysseus gets blown off course so much is because of what happens with the Cyclops. All that stuff's really important. Okay, so those are your big plot structure ideas. That's the stuff that you need to know in order to begin writing your book and organizing your ideas into the actual complete story, which is the events happening. Now, how you mix those things in and how you introduce elements of the setting and the characters, we'll talk about that probably in another episode. For now, that's the main stuff that you need to know about plot. Let's talk about plot arcs actually before I close this lecture down. Notice the video thumbnail is Gendo. It's like the Neon Genesis Evangelion. So this is a good example of a story with a plot arc. What's a plot arc? Well, it's really that you have some sort of episodic structure like with a TV show. We're looking at like an Odyssey structure, really. Where there's a conflict and a resolution for every episode, like with Star Trek. But there's some larger conflict that's going on above and beyond it that gives reason and rhyme to most of the things that are happening in each episode. So yeah, they're fighting the aliens. What is Gendo doing? What are the things that he's doing behind the scenes? So as you get deeper into the Neon Genesis Evangelion series, you uncover more and more of the deeper level of why characters are doing what they're doing and the past of the setting as well, which contributes to that. So when you're doing an arc, it's just like doing an Odyssey structure, just, kind of more drawn out. And you can think of it like that. So if you're writing a book series, what's the plot arc of the book series? Well, there should be some final solution. Should be some final conflict that has to be solved, has to be resolved. And each episode is going to contribute to that a little bit, uncover a little bit more of the mystery, or give the characters another tool for solving the main conflict problems, so on and so forth. Okay, so you're just looking at kind of like Odyssey, but adapted to like a TV series, right? Also talk about soap opera, maybe. Soap opera doesn't really fit into this. Soap opera is about a continual fugue of conflict and resolution. So this is why Game of Thrones is so popular, is that it's a soap opera. It's a soap opera outside of the normal soap opera format. Turns out people are very motivated to watch soap operas, but they may not be interested in soap operas on daytime TV. What's a soap opera format? Well, it just means you have lots of little conflicts and resolutions happening at the same time. Character has a problem he needs to solve. It's introduced in episode 200. It's solved in episode 210. Episode 201, you solve a problem from episode 191. And you introduce a new problem that has to be solved in episode 215, right? So you have a bunch of problems and their solutions that are just overlapping. Imagine just like a bunch of little arcs bounding over each other. That's why soap operas can go on for like 50 years. How can a soap opera go on for 50 years? And none of the characters are there. It's like when you write a character out of a show, you've already written new characters in. They have their own conflicts. It just continues and continues and rolls on and on and on. So Game of Thrones can kill off all of its main characters and keep going forever because it's a soap opera. And George R.R. Martin knows how to write a soap opera so that there's always something up in the air. This is actually how he does it in the book, if you want to know technically. Anytime that there is a conflict introduced or a resolution proposed, he leaves that character and goes to another one that has another conflict. The character realizes someone's going to kill my husband. In chapter, now we're going to have the dwarf and his problems. He finds a solution to his problems. In chapter, we're not going to show that solution. We're going to show it 50 pages from now. Let's go back to Ned Stark. Oh, he gets, he gets betrayed by this guy. In chapter, let's go check in on Jon Snow. He's got a problem. He's got a solution. Okay, he solved the problem that we talked about before. Cool. Oh, here's a new problem. In chapter. Go to another character. Right? It's a really simple trick, guys. You can use it, and, my hat's off to you if you're able to do it correctly, because it can work. I'm not trying to dog on George R.R. Martin, but when you know the secret of the sauce, you're not as impressed by it, right? What's in the secret sauce? What's this secret barbecue sauce? It's mayonnaise and ketchup, baby, and sugar. Oh, that doesn't sound very good on its own. Yeah, but you liked it when you ate it. You liked it when it was on the ribs. So, good for him. All right. So there's probably other things I could say about ways to execute plot, but those are the big ones. And I always tell people, you got to take risks. You got to try to do it your own way. Don't try to fit things too tightly into some, this is the way you have to write. It's kind of like writing in certain song forms, right? Like, oh, I'm going to write in sonata allegro. Like, that can be really stifling, which is why Beethoven didn't do it. Yeah, okay. Let's listen to the first movement of Fifth Symphony. Okay, yeah, it's definitely sonata allegro. What? What's going on? Oh, yeah, he just put some extra phrases in there because he finds A, B boring. So there's just a big transition phrase before any repeats. And then when he repeats, he does a bunch of variations because he would find it boring to just repeat things. That was Beethoven. Beethoven hated boring music and would never want his music to be boring. So he never stuck really hard to like the formats. Yeah, the format is where he started with. Oh, this is a rondo. Yeah, it's a rondo, but with all of these exceptions to it, you know. So yeah, you got to be more like Beethoven and not try to be Handel. Even Handel would be like the Surprise Symphony. It's like, okay, everybody knows the format of the symphony. Bop! Oh, what was that? I didn't usually hear that. Okay, yeah, I'm doing some things you shouldn't expect. You should always do something that's a little outside the box, something that people aren't going to expect. Otherwise, they'll get bored. Have you ever checked out the Lester Dent Pulp Paper Master Fiction Plot? You've linked it for me before, but I haven't really read it. Well, it's a formula, also emphasizes variety. Even Michael Moorcock has used it. Yeah, there's a lot of different approaches you can use. I've linked some in the Discord and stuff. They're all good starting places for thinking like, okay, I need this kind of event to happen. Oh, that's a good event that can happen in my story. So it's a good way to think about what events should happen in your story, but you don't have to stick to it. In fact, I don't think Lester Dent would have been as successful if like he wrote, I don't know how many shadow novels he wrote, like 100 or something. It's really insane how much he wrote. Obviously, people would not be buying book 100 if it didn't have some kind of difference from book 1. You know what I mean? So even though every shadow novel would have the shadow in it, you might have different kinds of plots. It might be a mystery plot. It might be something different, you know. You uncover the mystery in different ways. The climax may happen at an unexpected time in an unexpected place, and that's what keeps the story interesting. Why I get annoyed with Hollywood is they don't do that, right? It's like they start with the format and do no variety. They're like, no, it has to happen exactly like this, and every movie has the exact same conflict, or the exact same, like, the conflict resolution happens at the exact same place for every movie. It gets really boring. Even with stuff like romantic comedies where you think you're not that tied in, it's like you're more tied in with the lower budget stuff than with the high budget stuff, believe it or not. It's wild how like format heavy something like a romantic comedy is. Star Trek TNG equals Odyssey. Well, no. Let me address that. Star Trek The Next Generation, same as Star Trek, the original series, does not have a plot arc. So it's not an Odyssey. It's episodic. Each episode has its own plot format. Sometimes it's a mystery. Sometimes it's like a 3-act man versus man plot. Sometimes it's a 2-part, really longer plot like Chain of Command. Right? There are many. Every episode is its own plot. And this is true with the original series. Every episode is its own plot with its own conflict and its own resolution that's separate from all the others. You have to think about how TV series worked prior to the internet, where even though Star Trek fans were definitely the kinds of fans that would tune in every week, they were still a small portion of the viewing base, even for Star Trek. You couldn't have a soap opera in space in 1990 because you couldn't count on people watching every single week. So if they tuned in, and you could have a couple 2-parters, but you weren't going to do too much more than that because the audience would actually tune out if they didn't understand what was happening. That's just how it is, right? Now, soap operas kind of use that to their advantage. It's like you have to tune in every week to know what's going to happen. You have to tune in every day. But for Star Trek, like, it really needed to stay episodic. So, like, The Simpsons is not an odyssey either. The Simpsons is just a bunch of episodes. Where it starts to get into plot arc territory is Voyager and Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine is completely episodic for the first 2 seasons. And once we get a war with the Cardassians, we start to get an actual plot arc. And until you get to the final season, season 7, which is one big story with lots of little Odyssey plot things. So the final season of Deep Space Nine is definitely an Odyssey. It's one big story. It's one of the best conclusions to any series, any TV series that I can think of. It's great. But yeah, the Next Generation and TOS were just written to be episodic. And that's why I love them. Is you can look at each episode as its own thing, doing its... Yeah, characters sometimes change or grow between them, but for the most part, Jean-Luc Picard isn't that much different in the last season than he is in the first. Everything in The Hobbit is hungry. Yeah. I say the goblins are hungry, Gollum's hungry, trolls are hungry. Maybe the giants aren't hungry. Wargs are hungry. Dwarves are hungry. The dwarves are very hungry in the forest. That's what gets them into trouble with the elves. They're greedy. They're not hungry by... I mean, hunger is not the issue by the time they get to like the final battle, I guess. I'm trying to find like the correct... There we go. This is just not wanting to stay put. It's like too heavy for the arm. All right. Lester Denton wrote Doc Savage. Walter Gibson wrote The Shadow. Thank you. Okay. Doc Savage versus The Shadow. I'm getting confused here. So yeah, Walter B. Gibson wrote a billion Shadow novels. That's always the thing too, is like, oh, you can't write good and fast. I'm like, well, Michael Moorcock did it. Walter B. Gibson did it. You know, Lester Dent did it. I mean, even Robert E. Howard was very prolific, just not in the long book category, right? And wrote great things. He could write a great thing in a day, you know. So being prolific and being good are not antithetical. That's a modern idea based on people not knowing all the stuff that I'm talking about and not willing to use it, right? So for me, if I have an idea for a story and the idea is really important, I'm not going to sit around and muse and just sort of type 100 words a day into a word processor hoping a plot appears on the page that supports my idea. I'm going to plug it into one of these plot formats I'm going to talk about. I'm like, okay, I have this idea. And I'm going to need a big climax. What's a good climax for this? Put that here. And then I kind of come up with a rough outline. I write it down as an event sequence. This happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. With the characters, boom, I have my book ready to go. Then I just go to my word processor. And then I'll usually make some micro notes as well, depending on how long the book is. So like, you know, the book I'm working on right now is really long. I have a lot of micro notes where it's like, these 3 events need to happen right now, right? And then I have a big event list. They go here. Like there may be 10 events that need to happen between the big event here and big event here. So I just kind of like make up those 10 events and make sure that those are like in the outline. So whenever I sit down at the word processor, I'm not going like, what are they doing now? But I sit down and I go, okay, this is what they're doing now. Is there anything else I need to add to that? That's my like thought for the day, my creativity. Maybe I'll have them do this, or I'll have them have this conversation about this important topic while they're doing that stuff. And then I can just write it, you know, and it's easy. So the more outlining you do, the easier it is to draft. That's the way it is, guys. The more you understand the plot, the more you understand the characters, the more you understand all this crap that I'm talking about, just the easier it's going to be to do your draft. It just gets so much easier when you are willing to outline. So I really encourage you to do it. How do you outline? Well, there's a million ways to outline. So don't get stuck. Organize your thoughts in a way that makes sense to you. I don't want to like pass out worksheets because I think that can be a little bit too stifling. So here's your worksheet for plot. Like my son has worksheets for stories that we do, but he doesn't like them because he's like, no, I want my characters to do this other thing, you know? Today, some people think every writer has to be like Tolkien in terms of how long it takes to write. And the other thing we're kind of discovering about Tolkien is he wrote a lot more than we think he did. But he lived and worked in a time where most of his writing simply could not be published, and he didn't write it thinking anyone would ever care to read it. So he had that with the Silmarillion. It's like, basically people told me that he's like, I wanted to publish this first, and people are like, this will never be published. And it wasn't published until he was dead. The Silmarillion was. It's like, how does Tolkien keep coming out with these books? Well, he actually wrote a lot of things, but you couldn't really come out with them at the time because publishers were like, no one wants to read like Children of Húrin. Even now, like, modern people are like, I don't like this story. It's not a story I like. It's like, of course not. It's good. That's why you don't like it. Tolkien was anti-modern. What was he? He was inspired by stuff like Beowulf, which he translated, and mythology and things that don't have the endings that we're used to with the modern kind of post-corporate mindset. Like, the corporate art mindset is all about satisfying the reader and giving them a happy ending. Ancient literature, not so much. It's about deeper things. So that's what inspired Tolkien. And so some of the stories, especially in the Silmarillion, have really tragic endings. They're tragedies. They're mythology. So it makes sense that publishers were not willing to publish it until he was basically already so successful that people would buy. You know, it's like I'm super excited, actually, that like Tolkien is so popular with Lord of the Rings, because you're going to have people that read something like Children of Húrin, which I really like, who would never read a story like that otherwise. They would never pick up a fantasy story that is like Children of Húrin and enjoy it. Like, you have to kick down the barrier of, I guess you just have to kick down that barrier. You have to kick down the barrier of, like, I want stories that are like this. They're like Harry Potter. Have this resolution like this. No, it gets people to experience things that have a deeper and more original format to them. Yeah, Children of Húrin has a completely different kind of plot format than what we're talking about. It proceeds more like an old legend. Things don't fit neatly into like a 3-act plot structure. And this is why I say you don't have to use this. People hear plot formats and like, I have to do this. It's a starting place. It doesn't need to be your end place. When I wrote the book Al-Shafaltha, it is very much not in a modern format at all. It's weird. Now, it has its fans. There are people who are like, this is my favorite book that you wrote. This is what's really weird and cool. I'm like, yeah, thanks. I wanted it to be weird and cool. I had to take a lot of risks. But, you know, one of the reasons I held off on publishing it for a while was like, I took a good look at it as a person with some business experience, some experience in the publishing business. I'm like, this is not a book people are going to pick up and buy on Amazon. This doesn't hit all those genre tropes. It doesn't do the things that people want it to do. It's just not going to be popular. So I kept that in mind as I wrote it. I'm like, could I edit this into something that would be popular? No, not without losing the core of what makes it cool. So screw it. I don't care if people read it. I'm going to come out with it. And for like the people who love the story, this story's for you. For the people who hate that kind of story, I can't get into it, find it too weird, are too put off by like the conflict and the strangeness of the characters or anything else that I happen to do, hey, it's not for you. It's okay. I'm okay writing books at this point that no one reads. As I am reminded of something George Lucas said, because George Lucas was like, I'm making a book, I'm making movies everyone's going to hate. Like, he said that about like the prequels. It's like, I don't care if people like them. I'm making the movies that I want to make. He spent his whole life working hard to be super successful and build a fortune so he could make the stories he wanted to make. That is cool. Regardless of what you think about the prequels, the fact that George was able to do something that was so himself, that was so what he imagined and what he was going for, that's really cool. It's hard to have that courage. And I'll tell you the truth is, the longer you're in the business, the more you get sucked into the idea that you have to adhere to what the market already wants, or you're going to fail. You'll never find really big success doing that, first of all. all the super successes you can think about were outside the box, at least a little bit. You know, whether it's something like Lord of the Rings, honestly, it was outside the fantasy box when it came out. Or it's something like Twilight, it's outside the vampire box, you know. You have to do something a little bit original, or it's just, there's no, you really won't find the success. But the longer you do this as like an indie artist, the more you're like, I have to hit this micro genre, do it this certain way, or I won't make any money. It's like, well, people who are doing that aren't making any money either, so you might as well do the crap you want to do. You know what I'm saying? Ducat died weird in DS9. I'm in a very influential lobbying group, Concerned Citizens Against Holodeck Episodes. That's great. Yeah, the holodeck episodes. So I love the holodeck as a device. So like, how about we make this thing called a holodeck? We put it in episode 1. People are like, whoa, it's cool. Here's the thing. We don't have to go find a planet where the Nazis are in charge. We can just get people trapped on the holodeck and have to fight the Nazis on the holodeck. I love it. So it lets you just put the characters in whatever zany situation you want. We're going to have a holodeck episode where they go to the Old West. We're going to holodeck. In the original series, they had to discover weird planets that would do stuff like that. And it becomes increasingly weird. Like, here's a planet that gives you whatever you want. Like, here's a planet where the Nazis are in charge. Here's a planet where the Soviet Union won. It's like, what? This doesn't make any sense. They're good stories though, right? Here's a time travel episode. So there's two kinds of episodes that I really don't like it when Star Trek does: time travel and holodeck. Although I like both of them. Why don't I like them? They don't really fit into the overall universe well. Like time travel. Well, if we could just time travel, we should just do that, right? So yeah, time travel. And then holodeck. Well, the holodeck is not exploring space, is it? It's just throwing the characters into a weirdo. It's doing Doctor Who for an episode, you know? Love Children of Hurin is good. Very dark and sad, but well told. Thank you. I know I'm not alone there in thinking this stuff. Let's see here. But David, the focus group said people like romance and everything. Yeah. Yeah, I like this one. I trust those focus groups more if they were more of a general slice of the population, but Hollywood has been called out for a while now for using people connected to production crew instead. Yeah, I mean, there's a problem with focus groups. If you focus grouped half the crap that's popular, it wouldn't have been popular. You would have edited out the things that were cool about it. Like Twilight or something like that. Just wouldn't be there. You know? That's the problem with focus groups. I wonder what the original version of the Black Cauldron, Disney's Black Cauldron, would be like if it weren't for focus groups. They brought in focus groups and the kids were screaming and running out of the theater terrified of like the skeletons melting on screen. I'm like, that's cool. They even had like I don't know, they had a lot of weird stuff in that one. It's like, I wonder what that would have been without focus groups. But the focus groups probably made the movie worse because it made him change directions away from what was like inspired by the books towards something that was more in a Disney format, and it probably made the Black Cauldron a worse movie. Like, let's be honest. Now, that's the problem is if you have something that is one thing and you bring it to a focus group that doesn't like that thing, then your response to the focus group is going to be, well, how can we make it like the thing that they want? Then it's no longer the thing you started with. Hollywood has a big problem with this, with like rewriting screenplays. Like The Last Action Hero, the original screenplay was written by two guys who wrote it as a comedy. It was like a farce or like a satire. And by the time they were done with it, it was no longer a satire and it was no longer good. You know, that's just the way it works. If you do too much of that, then you strip it of all its originality. I was surprised to discover Silmarillion was supposed to be published with Lord of the Rings. Seems like oversaturated, particularly how dense those stories are. It's more like a series of short stories. You know, I stole that book from my father as a teen. Took forever to read Tolkien again besides The Hobbit, which was and still is my favorite book. Hobbit is a great movie. Or a great book. It's one of the best Western books I think you can read. It's so tight. It has such good characterization. It has such good plot. And it has such a good adventure, such great exposition of the setting. It's really like almost a perfect book, you know? A lot of holodeck episodes seemed like script recycling from other series. Yeah, that might have been what it was. A writer's like, well, I had this idea for, this story in this Western that they didn't pick up the pilot. Could we do it here? Like maybe Jean-Luc and Data go to the Old West. It'll be funny because Data's like, why do cowboys do this? Well, you see, Data, in the 19th century, let's have a history lesson and talk about how funny we think the past is. They didn't have toilets that would vaporize their poo-poo. They didn't have replicators that would make whatever you wanted. They would have to cook their food. They'd have to poop into a hole and cover it with dirt. Isn't that funny, Data? Sir, I find it perplexing as to why anybody would wipe their butt with a corn cob. Well, you see, Data, they didn't have toilet paper. What they did wipe their bottom with was pages from the Sears catalog. Sir, you don't expect us to actually wipe our butts with Sears catalog pages while we're in the holodeck? Data, you have to get into the setting. Perhaps now would be a good time to remind you that I do not defecate, sir. Data! Would you want to defecate? I don't know. I've never thought about it, sir. Do you think it's part of the human experience? Most definitely. Then I will talk to Geordie about inserting a defecation protocol into my routines. Let's not talk about this with anyone else or on television, Data. Yes, peeing and pooping are an essential part of the human experience. I heard the other day I heard Jonathan say that the problem with Tolkien is that it's too good versus evil, that you can't understand the point of view of Sauron, unlike the Bible where you can understand Pharaoh. Jonathan Pajot, maybe? I must have missed that. Well, Sauron is the devil. Like, Sauron is not just a guy. He's not Pharaoh, right? And actually, Tolkien's very humanizing of even orcs, where Sam and bad humans, where Sam thinks, like, what lies led him on this long journey from home. Sauron is both king and god. Sauron is immortal. He's a godlike being, right? He's a fallen angel. He's not just like, because Tolkien's conflict is higher than Pharaoh, merely Pharaoh, even though I don't want to obviously God was involved in that, right? There was even sorceries where the sorcerers of Egypt turned the Nile to blood. But we're fighting like the devil. Do we need to think of the devil's perspective? The devil is the devil. He wants to dominate all life. He wants it to be ordered in the way that he wants to order it. All that's actually, Tolkien goes deep into the motivations of Melkor and Sauron, very deep. And it's interesting that he thinks that it's too good versus evil. No one thought Melkor was irredeemable. They thought he could be reformed, right? That he could go away from wanting to dominate others and make things his own and own them. We're talking about gods. It's more it's mythological. Cauldronborn were supposed to be very scary. I think they were still scary, but you can see some of the test run stuff. It's way more scary. Do you think that Shakespeare had a version of a focus group? I have no idea. I don't know at all. I don't think he did, but I knew that he was writing to an audience. Both patrons and people who would pay to see the play, right? Disney executives uses friends and family test audiences. Sorry. I had horrible allergies today. It's just been awful. They do it to prevent plot leaks, but it also means that their feedback is from upper class Los Angeles people. Yep. You can understand Sauron's psychology just fine. He thought he was smarter than everyone else and wanted to order the whole world to his will. Melkor wanted to make things, he wanted to be God. He wanted to make things. He wanted to be God. So that means he wanted to own the world. He wanted to make things that were new and original of his own design. But the thing is that because he's not God, because he is only understands a part of the mind of God, he can't create new things. Even Aule can't, because he doesn't fully understand God. He can't make the elves. He can make what's honestly not a mockery, but an imitation of them in the dwarves. Okay, they did an episode, but it was with Worf and his son. It was actually a fun episode. Jonathan Pajot. Okay, yeah. He can be wrong. The Silmarillion, which I've actually read more times than I have Lord of the Rings because it's shorter. I've read Silmarillion quite a bit, but Silmarillion's great because you can like hop around and just read one story you like or another one. It's great in that way. Lester Din's plot seems to be 4 acts, although I'm not sure how many acts you would classify it as. It doesn't. You can do 4 acts, right? 4 areas. A lot of times, I mean, you could take the 3 act and divide it into 4 areas: exposition, conflict, beginning, right? Lead up to a battle, and then the resolution, right? So sometimes we can actually take a 3 act and just kind of reinterpret it to be 4 act. These are ways to interpret the importance of events for most things, not a way to formally divide it like you would with a play. Shakespeare uses formal divisions. That's part of the tradition and the practical nature of the plays that he was writing. So we don't have to have formal divisions if we don't want them. Data, corn cobs. The screw tape letters also give some insight into Sauron's point of view. Yeah, for sure. Like, my dear Wormwood. I think Jonathan didn't read the Silmarillion. Even this stuff is in the Lord of the Rings too. You just have to pay attention to it. Manwë does not. Yeah, that was Manwë's mistake. Tulkas knew what was up. Manwë knows best the mind of Iluvatar. And so part of the mind of Iluvatar is knowing that people can be what they choose to be in terms of good or evil. That even Sauron could turn from what he was maybe and be recovered. But you kind of contrast this with like actual maybe Catholic theology about, should you pray for the devil? And the answer is usually no, that option is really no longer his, whereas you are still living your life and you have the option to choose good and evil. The devil doesn't really anymore. So anyway, interesting contrast to think about, I think. Today's focus groups are comment sections on rumor articles leaked by the studios. I think Anna Taylor is a Silver Surfer. Very intentional. Yep. That's a good point, too. I hadn't thought of that. Right, you leak these weird little things to get people talking, either positively or negative, to generate some buzz. Generate buzz, as they say. And it works. I mean, I can't say it doesn't work, right? People pay attention to them. They do it. So... The Black Widow movie director said one scene got cut because the test audience complained that it pandered to the male gaze. That doesn't sound like a general audience complaint. Yeah, really. That sounds like you put a bunch of feminists in a room and they're like, I can't believe they did that. Though I could see like me as a person being like, this is gratuitous. Like I could give that feedback if it was actually gratuitous, but I doubt it was. Be like, I don't know why you had to just show her butt crack in the outline of her vulva like that. That's gratuitous. Usually, I mean, to me, like things that are obviously gratuitous are pretty obvious. Versus a woman looks pretty, that's not male gaze to me. Quote, male gaze. It's not like bad lust. It's like the female form is beautiful. Obviously. So anytime a female is on screen, you are going to notice the female form because it is what it is. And if you find that attractive or beautiful, then you're going to admire the beauty of it. Versus doing something that's specifically designed to like be a thirst trap, to try to induce lust with people. It's difficult to define objectively because it's not really an objective thing. This is part of the problem with trying to define pornography, right? I know it when I see it. I know obscenity when I see it. But that's not really a good legal standard, right? But it's one we have to think about as artists. People often ask, like, how do I avoid, like, I'm like, it's really in your intent, right? If you're describing intimately things that would provoke someone to feel feelings of lust, and you don't want to do that, then don't do that. Like, you should know the things and the feelings that you're trying to evoke. And if somebody it happens to be aroused by you describing someone taking off their shoes, or like by a shot of a woman like taking her shoes off, that's not up to you. That's like a fetish thing, right? You don't have to worry about that. Oh, I should probably take this scene of the woman taking her shoes off because someone might in the audience might have a foot fetish. No, that's too much, right? But showing her nude or in like provocative way that asks you to gaze upon parts of her body that are normally reserved for a single individual, then yeah, you could be crossing over into that territory. And if you don't want to do that, you should know ahead of time that that's what you're doing. Don't modern superhero movies have more of a 4-act than a 3-act structure? It doesn't matter how you put it out. A hallmark of them is having a low point in the middle of the movie, the end of Act 2. We call that Dark Night of the Soul. Usually happens in like Act 3. You know, you can find a beat sheet, like find the like Save the Cat beat sheet, and then apply it to a Marvel movie. You'll find it lines up, but they're just longer now, right? So they stretch them out over 2.5 hours rather than like 90 minutes. So it won't line up exactly. Maybe some of them are 4-act. A 4-act would be like you have like kind of 2 big battles. So that makes a lot of sense. Maybe they are 4-act. But it doesn't really matter what way you want to squeeze them into. What matters is like the significance of the events and how they relate to a plot or a subplot. You don't have to stick to debating whether this is 3 or 4-act. It actually doesn't really matter. What matters is how the events pertain to the conflict and whether there's too long of a time between them or not. If you take too long of a time between plot events, it gets boring. That's all. I think of Melkor like the lead singer of a rock band. He was right about the Valar, and the Valar were right about him. Valinor is boring. That's why people keep leaving. I actually have that in my books. Like, the elves are like, why would you leave the elf realm? And they're like, I'm bored, right? It's the same stuff, and there's no vitality to that. You just fall into the long sleep and disappear, right? Like, I don't want that. I want to be alive. And being alive means taking risks. I'm surprised Peugeot would say such a thing given who he knows. I'm curious what the full context is. Regardless, from listening to the Amon Sewell podcast, I could say that I'm surprised to learn just how complex a villain Sauron actually is. I think he's actually one of the most complex Dark Lords in all of fiction, but you wouldn't pick that up from Lord of the Rings easily. Yeah, in Lord of the Rings, he's very distant. And we're learning about him in the past and the threat that he's exerting from the past versus learning about what he did in the Second Age. He's a very crafty kind of guy. I want more Sauron, really. I would love to have like stuff that's further in the past that's actually good, to know some of that history deeper, but it's what it is. Part of, I think, the greatness of Tolkien is that the characters are walking through an ancient world, stepping back into time and seeing these places from the past of Middle Earth, like Khazad-dûm and Amon-Sul, the Weathertop, and the ruins of Arnor, Rivendell, Lothlorien, which is kind of out of time. It's a place where they've captured the First Age and kept the First Age going kind of forever. Like, it's great. So Dark Night of the Soul, this is from Save the Cat. It's from other screenwriting manuals. It just means there's a point where the action stops and the character reflects on themselves and is depressed and feels bad about themselves. They have to look inwardly and decide about who they really are and whether they're up to the task, things like that. So that's the Dark Night of the Soul. They literally have a Dark Night of the Soul in like Monsters University, where he goes into the summer camp and just stays there as a monster and sits down by the lake with Sully and like reflects about what a bad guy he is. That's a classic one. It's literally at night. It's in the dark of night. But yeah, that's what they call it, the Dark Night of the Soul. You're going to hear that with a lot of people talk about, plot formats and stuff. A lot of screenwriting manuals will talk about it, which is why every movie has the same thing in it. The male gaze to that Black Widow focus group was probably criticizing skin tight, form-fitting latex suits, the work uniform of Black Widows. Yeah, the specific Black Widow scene that got cut was Natasha waking up and getting out of bed wearing a t-shirt and panties because of the hot weather. Yeah, I actually don't care that much about them cutting stuff like that. It just doesn't matter that much to me. Yeah. Anyway, I think I'm about ready to be done here. It's 7:30, so I did the little pre-stream with the music, kind of bled over into the mainstream. So I'll probably do that in the future. It's just like do music, do something else before the stream, and then begin it at a certain time and then go on. I'll should stream at the regular time this upcoming week, Wednesday, 6 p.m. Central Time. So that's 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific. And I'll see you guys next time. You can join the Patreon, of course, and different levels of Patreon are going to give you different things, including access to a masterclass stream, which I'd like to start doing maybe in December. So we'll see how that goes. And free books. I don't know what this month's free book is. Eyes in the Walls. And everybody gets a copy of Keys of Prolific Creativity, depending on the level you pick up. So do check that out. And then, of course, the No Talkie Talkie channel. It's all music. I'll link that in case anyone's interested in just having like the ambient background music that's on it. I just did a very long piece with like some rain ambience. It was way more trouble than I thought it would be to do, but you can check that out over there. And I'll see you guys next time. Have a great one. And yeah, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe I will queue up some music here. What's something good? What's something good? People are liking this one. I'll do this one. After we do an ad. Somehow there's ads running on this channel, even though I'm not monetized, but there you go. Oh, I got to turn on the... Hold on. Here it goes. All right. There's some music. Play me out, keyboard cat. Bum, bum, ba, da, bum. Do you think you might check out the Lester Dent Pulp Master? I'll check it out. I'll check it out for you, yeah. I think you've linked it in Discord before, so... But you can link it again, and I'll try to read it this week. I've been kind of on a nonfiction kick anyway. I haven't been reading a lot of fiction the last couple of weeks. Just sometimes I got to take a break from stories and read about Romans, that kind of stuff. So have a great one, guys, and I'll see you all next time.